Bloodline, El Salvador, Chapter 8. Nadia Villalobos waited for the RTD bus on Main Street in the garment district of downtown Los Angeles. She had worked late, and a hazy mixture of smog and dusk was beginning to darken the streets. The area was covered with squat, bar-covered brick buildings, most of which had been converted to sewing sweatshops to support the burgeoning garment industry of Los Angeles. The graffiti-covered bus finally lurched to a stop in front of Nadia about 10 minutes late. She dropped a few coins into the fare holder and managed to find a seat near the front of the crowded bus. The passengers were mostly commuters from the downtown area, but a few Hispanic youths sat near the back of the bus. As the bus left the downtown area and headed into the South Central district, more black passengers boarded the bus. A few of the younger ones looked like gang types. Nadia could feel the tension rising in the air as the black youths eyed the Hispanic youths sitting near the back of the bus with unconcealed hostility. The fact that the black youths had to stand while the Hispanics got to sit obviously didn't help matters. A group of 3 black gang members was getting increasingly belligerent.
"What is this shit? We're in the brothers' neighborhood and we got to stand while these wetback motherfuckers be kicking it? What the fuck's the deal?"
one youth loudly asked the other. The other youth retorted,
"Yeah, wetbacks think they can dog the hood and everything be cool. I don't play that shit, motherfucker." "Hey, wetback,"
he sneered at a tough-looking Hispanic boy sharing a seat with a school-aged girl.
"I don't mean to be rude, but it's time to get your Mexican ass up for the brothers."
The Hispanic boy sullenly turned his head and ignored the black youth's demand.
"Boy, are you deaf or don't you speak no motherfucking English? Get the fuck out of my seat!"
yelled the black youth directly into the Hispanic boy's face, his spittle flying in every direction. Without a word, the Hispanic boy slowly rose and in one motion pulled a revolver out of a paper bag he was holding and shot the black youth through his upper thigh. The bullet ended its destructive journey in the stomach of a young girl sitting in the seat to the side of the altercation. The bus driver slammed on the brakes and most of the passengers were thrown onto the floor. Pandemonium followed. Panic-stricken passengers trampled each other in their frenzy to get to the bus doors. The bus driver hadn't opened the bus doors, and so many people jammed into the front of the bus that the windshield burst out of its rubber molding. Several passengers hurtled through the opening and fell to the pavement below. Nadia lay under several bodies on the floor, her face bloodied by a high heel that had grazed her cheekbone during the stampede for the door. After the bus incident, Nadia was afraid to catch the bus home by herself at night. The morning bus wasn't a problem, but the night bus had a completely different atmosphere. The night and violence seemed to go hand to hand in the city. She asked Enrique to meet her after work to escort her home on the bus. Enrique really didn't mind escorting his mother. Enrique saw opportunity waiting for him in the streets. He usually caught the bus around noon and spent the rest of the day hanging out until it was time to meet his mother. He found his niche in the downtown street scene selling small quantities of marijuana to other street people hanging around. Marijuana was a much safer product to move in Los Angeles than the crack cocaine that most of the other small-time dealers pushed. There was a world of difference in the sentences handed out to dealers selling crack cocaine as opposed to dealers selling a few joints. Cocaine got a lot of bad press, and the negative publicity greatly influenced the county judge's decisions. After his brutal experience at the hands of the El Salvador police, Enrique made up his mind to minimize the risks that he took in his career as a juvenile delinquent. Downtown Los Angeles is a city of great contrast between the prosperous and the poor. Streets lined with 60-story ultra-modern skyscrapers coexist next door to streets jammed full of Mexican flea markets called mayoreas, cut-rate clothing stores, and cheap retail electronic shops. Thousands of professional people commute from affluent suburbs to white-collar office jobs each morning, 5 days per week. They drive their late-model cars and pay exorbitant rents for underground parking in the bowels of skyscrapers. Meanwhile, thousands of poor, often illegal immigrants commute daily by bus from their cockroach-infested projects to menial textile and garment industry jobs in the industrial section of downtown. During the daytime, downtown Los Angeles is tolerable and even a bit interesting with all the different cultures selling their respective products and foods. As the night falls, so does the quality of civilization. The homeless, the derelicts, and the addicts, or a combination of all 3, come to life, transforming the vital financial center into a minefield of unknown dangers, poverty, and despair. The air-conditioned glass and chrome veneer of daytime civilization is crudely scraped off nightly to reveal an underlying trench of urine-stained sidewalks and garbage-strewn alleyways lined with the homeless. The white-collar professionals safely make their escape at quitting time, leaving the poor to fend for themselves throughout the night. Enrique got off the bus at 4th and Hill and walked to Pershing Square. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the grass was littered with the sleeping bodies of transients escaping the summer heat under shade trees.
"Hey, Enrique," greeted one of his homeboys in Spanish. "Do you have any mota today?" "I have a few joints left. That's about it," responded Enrique.
Enrique's acquaintance purchased a pin joint for $3, and Enrique ambled off to browse in the outdoor Mexican disco shops. Many of his customers made the same rounds, and Enrique hoped that if he kept himself sufficiently visible, he could unload the rest of his pre-rolled joints in the next couple of hours. He stopped to buy a triangular-shaped slice of watermelon sprinkled with chile powder from a street vendor. Spitting watermelon seeds as he walked, Enrique passed a seedy, narrow Mexican bar. The bar's door was propped open as a kind of wishful encouragement for ventilation, and strains of cumbia music echoed through the bar and out to the street. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke was strong, even outside the bar. When Enrique was a few yards past the door, a couple of men stumbled out of the bar, arguing loudly in Spanish. Enrique instinctively turned to look back toward where the drunken noise came from. His heart started hammering wildly in his chest when he saw one of the men. The man had a milky white eye and a silver-capped front tooth. There was no mistake. It was none other than Silvertooth, the man who had raped Enrique's mother in Baja California. The men did not see Enrique and continued staggering down the street away from where he was standing. Enrique waited until they were about a half-block away and then started stalking them. He followed them toward the Greyhound bus terminal and watched as they entered the lobby of a sleazy 4-story weekly hotel across the street from the terminal. Enrique slipped into the lobby and pretended he was making a phone call at the lobby payphone. Silvertooth's friend apparently had a room at the hotel, and the two separated in the lobby. Silvertooth left the hotel lobby and walked back into the street. Enrique caught up to him, parallel to an alleyway.
"Hey, vato, you want to buy some weed?"
propositioned Enrique to Silvertooth. Drunk and belligerent, Silvertooth turned to face a younger, smaller boy and shoved Enrique hard toward a dumpster in the alley. Enrique slammed into the dumpster against his left arm and fell to the pavement, holding his left arm in pain.
"Get out of here, hijo de puta," mumbled Silvertooth in slurred Spanish.
He turned on his heel and started stumbling toward the street. Enrique picked up a brick that was blocking up the dumpster wheels from rolling and hurtled towards Silvertooth, carrying the brick raised over his head in both hands. He slammed the brick so hard on Silvertooth's head that it broke into 2 pieces. Silvertooth crumpled to the pavement with a surprised and tried to crawl away like a drunken crab, too stunned to get up on his hands and knees. Enrique unsheathed the razor-sharp boning knife that he kept concealed in his boot and stood over Silvertooth's back. He dropped one knee hard into the small of Silvertooth's back and simultaneously pulled his head back by his greasy hair, exposing his stubble-covered neck. Enrique drew the edge of the boning knife hard across Silvertooth's throat and then slammed his face back down into the concrete. Enrique wiped the knife blade clean on Silvertooth's shirt and replaced his knife back into his boot sheath as a pool of blood slowly spread across the pavement underneath Silvertooth's body. Enrique started involuntarily shaking, and he forced himself up from the prone figure. He looked anxiously around. When he satisfied himself that he didn't have an audience, Enrique strode quickly out to the street. He walked about a half-block further, and then broke into a loping run and kept running aimlessly, block after block, without a clue as to where he was going. Finally, his wind gave out, and Enrique bent over, panting, his head down and his hands on both knees. He suddenly felt nauseous and vomited against a building wall. Passers-by eyed him in disgust and walked a wide swath around him. Downtown pedestrians were accustomed to the sight, and no one made an effort to help him. Enrique got back his bearings and slowly walked toward his mother's workplace, debating with himself whether he would tell her what he had done. Enrique had run quite a distance, and by the time he got to his mother's workplace, workers were already streaming out of the sweatshops and heading toward bus stops. He met his mother, and they boarded the bus in silence. Nadia was obviously tired, and they made no conversation until they stepped off the bus near the projects.
"I saw the man who raped you, Mama," Enrique said, not looking at his mother.
Nadia drew her breath in sharply and stopped walking. She stared straight ahead, waiting for Enrique to continue. "He will never hurt you again, Mama." "What did you do, Enrique?" his mother exclaimed in alarm. "Are la policía after you?" "No, Mama, don't worry. Nobody saw a thing." Nadia was distraught, but said nothing more as they walked toward the projects. It took several weeks before she could relax. Her heart raced every time she saw a patrol car cruise by. Eventually, her sense of impending doom subsided, and Nadia stopped visualizing Enrique's arrest whenever she saw a policeman. She would not admit how she felt, even to Enrique, but deep inside, Nadia felt that, for once in her life, justice had been done. Enrique's marijuana business continued to flourish downtown. He wasn't the least bit worried about the possibility of taking the murder rap for Silvertooth's violent death. Enrique figured, correctly, that Silvertooth was just another dead illegal alien as far as the LAPD was concerned, and that very little effort would be made to solve the case. It was during this time period that Enrique first became acquainted with Juan LaPorte. Juan was the exact polar opposite of Enrique. Raised solidly middle class and educated in private Catholic schools, Juan had the solid foundation to really do something constructive with his life. Juan, however, had other plans. Always a rebel, Juan preferred life in the fast lane. Good-looking, articulate, and outgoing, Juan drew people to him like a magnet. Like a magnet, Juan wasn't always discriminating about who he surrounded himself with. Juan loved the excitement of being around radical people living on the edge. Sometimes his acquaintances were so close to the edge that toppling over the edge with them was a real possibility. Enrique was a prime example of an acquaintance close to the edge. He exuded volatility. Most folks had the good sense to give him a wide berth, sometimes to the point of walking on the opposite side of the street when they saw him coming. Not Juan. Juan and Enrique hit it off famously from the start. Soon the two of them were nearly inseparable, dealing pinners to the stoners, getting into petty hassles with drunks and winos, and gaming the hookers and various sundry lowlifes in their downtown L.A. sphere of influence. From the start, they had come to a tacit agreement to avoid gangs and the suffocating lifestyle that went with it. Enrique had had a belly full of youth gangs in El Salvador. Being in a gang simply meant that the pie had to be split that many more ways. It also meant that the police would be watching you more closely. Juan had no opinion at all. Gangs didn't hang out at Catholic schools, so he followed Enrique's lead on gangbanging. They sold good dope to the bangers at a fair price, so Juan and Enrique were pretty much left alone. Both were good for one another in their own criminal fashion, Juan the calming influence for the crazy man's violent excesses, and Enrique the source of excitement for the former altar boy turned dope dealer. Fluent in both English and Spanish and born and raised in America, Juan also brought to the table a native business sense that Enrique would have taken years to develop. With Juan's encouragement, the two stashed away cash with the idea of making a large wholesale purchase when the opportunity came along. That opportunity came, ironically, in the form of a promise of holy matrimony. Some months back, Juan had met a pretty Latina at one of the downtown's many after-hour discotheques. Irene Chavez had migrated to the big city from Nogales, Arizona, a thriving entry point on the border between the United States and Mexico. Juan and Irene started hanging out. One thing led to another, and, in the heat of the moment, Juan proposed to Irene. He couldn't believe that those words had come out of his mouth, but the damage was already done. Irene took the whole marriage thing pretty seriously. As it turned out, Juan's new fiancée had excellent family connections. Irene had been born and raised in Nogales, Arizona. Her family had a long and rich heritage as Border Patrol guards, literally rich. For 3 generations, her grandfather, father, and brothers had looked the other way, for a price, as everything from animal skins of endangered species to booze and narcotics had passed through the Nogales border. His grandfather was corrupt 40 years ago, and her 2 brothers were corrupt today. Her brothers had turned a couple of the other Border Patrol guards, and, if the work schedule and cash payment was right, most anything could find a way across the border. Enrique and Juan decided to take a trip to Nogales to meet the in-laws. Enrique bought a stolen green card for $100 in anticipation of the trip across the border. They rode the Greyhound bus with a duffel bag full of clothes and a large steamer trunk packed with the empty 5-pound coffee cans with sealable plastic lids. Once they got to Nogales, they had a barbecue with Irene's brothers and discussed their plan. Both of Irene's brothers were older than her, with Peter being the oldest and Johnny a year younger than Peter. Peter and Johnny didn't participate in the drug game directly. They allowed plenty of narcotics to cross the border, but they knew better than to take an active role in buying and selling controlled substances. There were far too many DEA agents and other government agencies sniffing around the border towns. What they would do, as they told their new brother-in-law, was to introduce Juan to a good source in Mexico to buy marijuana in quantity. Juan and Enrique could then set up the deal themselves, and Irene's brothers would set up the time to cross the border safely with the shipment of weed. The plan was Juan and Enrique would rent a pickup truck, cross the border, and make the purchase themselves. Peter and Johnny were very selective about who they let know about their border scam. A relative, yes, but strangers from Mexico? Hell no. Enrique caught the vibes of how paranoid Peter and Johnny were about any smuggling operation. He figured that paranoia was probably the reason Peter and Johnny had never been busted. For this reason, Enrique told Juan that they should rent their own motel room in Nogales, Arizona, rather than try to stay with the in-laws. He knew that would help put the brothers more at ease, not having a couple of drug dealers as house guests. The next morning, Juan and Enrique went to a used car lot. Peter knew the owner and had called him in advance, so Juan and Enrique could rent a pickup truck without a credit card. He charged them plenty for the beat-up old '74 Chevy truck, but that was to be expected. Driving jaunts into Old Mexico were always a high-risk affair for both the vehicle and the driver. They met their connection at a local car wash and then followed him across the border into Nogales, Mexico. He took Juan and Enrique to a rundown shack in the poor section of town. The deal went smoothly enough. They paid $10,000 cash for 100 pounds of Mexican grown. It was a bargain in the prevailing market. The marijuana had been stuffed into two 40-gallon trash bags. The problem now was the fact that marijuana had a powerful odor, especially 100 pounds of it. Juan and Enrique had anticipated that problem beforehand, and they had brought the solution with them. They were eager to put as much distance between them and their suppliers as possible, so they bade their farewells and left. There were too many stories going around about Mexican drug dealers who sold a large shipment, then turned their customers over to the federales. The proceeds from the ensuing drug bust were then split with the federales. Juan thought of it as sort of a Mexican recycling program. They rented a room in an old dive in town and carried the garbage bags and steamer trunk into the room. They stuffed the 5-pound coffee cans full of marijuana and then replaced the plastic lids on the cans. They washed each sealed can with dish soap and dried each can with motel towels. The final step was to light a candle and carefully drip hot wax over the lip of the plastic lids while the coffee cans were resting on their sides. When the wax congealed, they had an effective seal that kept the pungent odor of the marijuana inside the coffee cans. The whole process took about 3 hours, and they still had a couple of hours to kill. They had been instructed to cross the border between 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Irene's brothers were on duty at that time, and the border traffic was light that early in the morning. They bought some tamales from a little boy on the street who was peddling them out of a 2-gallon tin pail covered with cloth. The time moved slowly with the anticipation of crossing the border, but finally it was time to go. Enrique first had a suspicion that something was wrong when they drove up to the border crossing and saw 2 men in dark suits observing the border guards doing their job. He felt a sinking sensation in his stomach but said nothing to Juan. It was too late to turn back now. When it was their turn, Juan was waved up to the inspection area by Irene's brother Johnny. Johnny came up to the truck looking official in his uniform, badge, and sidearm. He was a massive man, and the uniform made him look all the more imposing. "Gentlemen, may I see your identification, please?" he asked as the 2 men in suits sauntered over closer to watch the procedure. Juan produced his driver's license, and Enrique handed over his stolen green card. Enrique was now Eduardo Torres. Johnny looked at the ID cards and ordered Juan. "Mr. LaPorte, will you please switch off your motor and both of you step out of the truck, please?" As Juan opened the door, Johnny suddenly drew his sidearm and commanded sharply, "Keep your hands where I could see them and interlock your fingers across the back of your head, now!" Johnny roughly shoved both of them toward the wall. "Come on, gentlemen. You've seen enough movies to know the position." Juan and Enrique obediently angled their bodies against the wall, while Johnny quickly frisked them. Enrique was scared, really scared. They were speaking English, which only amplified his fear because he couldn't understand what was going on. Johnny's brother Peter strode purposely over to their truck and started ripping the cab apart. He removed the window handles and the door panels and peered intently into the metal skeleton of the door with his flashlight. He roughly pulled the junk from under the seat and pulled the back of the truck seat forward to search behind it. He pawed through the glove box, then lay flat on his back and hoisted himself up toward the dash cavity. He was finally satisfied and crawled back out of the cab floor. "Our amigos are clean so far," he called out to his brother. He started walking toward the bed of the truck. Enrique felt his knees almost buckle under him. Peter jumped into the truck bed and headed right for the trunk full of marijuana. Enrique looked sideways at Juan. Juan was shaking his head, eyes closed, with sweat pouring down his face and neck. "It's all over," thought Enrique in despair. Peter opened the trunk and stood there pondering for a moment. An Indian blanket covered the contents, but none of the men standing on the ground could see what was in the trunk anyway. He shifted the blanket to one side and groped around in the trunk for a minute or so. Finally, he slammed the trunk shut in disgust, jumped down from the tailgate, and strode over to where the two men in suits were standing. "Jesus," he said, shaking his head. "You'd think those guys could at least wash your clothes before packing them away." The men in the suits chuckled and walked back into the office with Peter. "Okay, guys," said Johnny to Juan and Enrique. "If you want to wait around a bit, we'll put your cab back together. If you want to clean up the mess yourselves, you're free to leave at any time." "No, man, we better get going," mumbled Juan. "We're renting this truck and we got to get it back to the lot." "All right, gentlemen. Sorry for any inconvenience we might have caused you." Juan slowly pulled the truck out of the inspection area and onto the street into Nogales, Arizona. Enrique was slumped against the pickup door, too weak from the emotional ordeal to sit up. He turned his head toward Juan and said only, "You've got some very amusing relatives, Vato." Then he slumped back down and stayed there until they got back to the motel room on the U.S. side. About an hour and a half later, someone knocked on their motel door. Juan peered out the curtains. Johnny and Peter were standing there, still in uniform. Juan opened the door, and the men came in the room. "Listen, guys," said Peter. "We really apologize about how we had to handle you, but we had no choice. The suits were DEA agents observing our procedures. We had no idea they were going to pop in, so we had to put on a good show for them." "Man, Peter," said Juan, "you guys had us shitting in our pants, ese. I thought you were serious, dude." The whole time Irene's brothers were there, normally hot-tempered Enrique was so relieved that he wasn't even upset. He already had a plan formulated as soon as Johnny and Peter left. His plan was to get stoned out of his gourd and dream of ways he could spend the $30,000 in profits that he and Juan were going to net from the operation. As fate would have it, that was the last time Juan and Enrique would ever smuggle weed across the Arizona border. About 3 weeks after they got back to L.A., Juan infected Irene with a particularly virulent strain of gonorrhea, a.k.a. the clap. The resulting scandal effectively cut Juan and Enrique off from any further contact with the Arizona in-laws. Irene angrily broke off the engagement, showing her displeasure by knocking him senseless with a ceramic table lamp. Still, with a little more luck, the Nogales venture should generate enough capital to help position themselves in a higher, more lucrative level of trafficking.